All right, welcome to Roots of Reality Experiences. Today I'm joined by Carlton Larson, who's a professor of law at the University of California, Davis. Professor Larson is one of the nation's leading authorities on the law of treason. Additionally, he's also written multiple books on the topic, with his latest being On Treason, A Citizen's Guide to the Law. So, Professor Larson, thanks for coming on today.
You're very welcome. Happy to be here.
So, just to start off, when did you first get interested in treason law?
It was during a course on the American Revolution that I took in college, and I was reading about James Wilson, he had these speeches in the Constitutional Convention that seemed pretty thoughtful and interesting, and I'd never heard of this man before. And so I was eager to learn more about him. I found out he was a Scottish immigrant, one of the top lawyers in Pennsylvania. And then I learned that he had defended persons accused of treason during the American Revolution. Even though he was a signer of the Declaration of Independence, he was one who was actually representing accused Tories and Loyalists in court. And I thought this was really fascinating. And then I started thinking about it. Well, wait, what's going on here? Wasn't the American Revolution itself an act of treason against the British king? It was a crime to levy war against the king. But now the Americans were doing exactly that, and they were punishing people who remained loyal to the king as treason. And so this suddenly seemed like a concept that was, in motion, and that it was fascinating to figure out what treason must have meant during this turbulent civil war, where loyalties were sort of constantly shifting. And so I started reading more about it. I ended up writing my college thesis on the subject and have been interested in it ever since.
Yeah, that is a super interesting concept that, yeah, probably we don't necessarily think about as much when it comes to the American Revolution. But yeah, one group's, treason is another group's kind of just revolution. So how did the founding fathers really understand the concept of treason? Did they think about themselves? Did they think like, we're technically committing treason, but this is, worth the cause?
So prior to independence, there was actually a lot of debate on this question, and they insisted that they were not traitors, that they were simply resisting unlawful, unconstitutional actions by the British Parliament. And therefore, it was ludicrous to call them traitors. Now, that said, they knew that if they lost, they would be subject to prosecution for treason
Right.
in an English court. And we tend not to, of course, think of them as traitors. Maybe they do in England. They probably still think of the revolutionaries as traitors to England. But there's the phrase from the British English courier James Harrington. Treason doth never prosper. What's the reason? For if it prosper, none dare call it treason. In other words, there's never been a successful treason. Because if it's successful, we don't call it treason. We
Mm.
call it a revolution and appropriate and authentic and justified or whatever. And so certainly that's how they would have thought of themselves after the revolution.
Yeah, that is interesting. So what was like the treason law then? What was, how did the founding fathers kind of enshrine the law of treason into this newly formed country then?
So they actually wrote a provision into the US Constitution. It's Article 3, Section 3, which defines the crime of treason. It says it's limited to levying war against the United States or adhering to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort. And that's a pretty unusual thing to have a definition of treason directly in a governing constitution. It's the only crime defined in our constitution. And part of that drew out of concerns, I think, that they didn't like being labeled as traitors for what they were doing prior to the war. The resistance activities, criticizing the government, things like that simply were not treason. And so they hoped to establish a fairly narrow definition of treason so that it wouldn't be used as a political tool, as a way to suppress dissidents. Now, they weren't writing on a clean slate. That language from the Article 3 is actually almost word for word, not quite, but from a 1351 English statute called the Statute of Treasons,
Mm.
passed during the reign of Edward III. And so there was a long English history of treason law. And so a lot of the revolutionary debates were conducted under that framework. That was a much more expansive statute. And the drafters of Article 3 used two of those provisions, levying war and adhering to enemies, and put them into the US Constitution.
Yeah, okay. So, over time in American history then has kind of scholars' interpretation of that law in the US changed at all over time with, emerging technologies, with things like cyber warfare or information warfare?
Yeah, yeah, it's actually very interesting to think about how this, sort of 18th century definition laid out in our Constitution would apply in modern times. And there have really been very few cases of treason actually charged in US courts and brought to any type of resolution. So we don't have a significant body of case law about this. I think there's a decent argument that certain types of cyber warfare would count as levying war against the United States. There's an interesting twist in that an early decision by John Marshall in the Aaron Burr case said that you have to have an assemblage of men to use sufficient force to levy war. And so the concern was, he said basically one person alone can't levy war. Well, what if that one person, goes into a defense system and launches a missile?
Yeah,
Right? Or what if that one person, launches a suitcase nuke? I think you clearly say that person is levying war. They're far more dangerous than 10 men with guns. But it's not clear that the treason law would necessarily capture that. Another problem is Article 3 says you have to have two witnesses to the same overt act. And that's typically meant to be eyewitnesses. So, what if you have a video camera that records somebody clearly committing an act of treason, but that's the only evidence you have?
right.
I think there's a real question as to whether you could convict somebody based on the videotape evidence alone, because you wouldn't have two eyewitnesses.
Yeah, that is interesting because it it does show this kind of generation gap with technology and, when obviously when the founding fathers, sort of created this country, there's lots of things that they could never have foreseen given how much things have changed over time. And how do we then as a modern society take these original founding documents and apply them in this very different world?
Well, I think it's like with a lot of things in the Constitution, you muddle through and
Yeah,
do the best you can. Um, you try to be faithful to the constitutional provisions, and those provisions are meant to be limiting. It is meant to have a fairly narrow definition of treason. So I don't think it's probably enough to say, well, times have changed. We should read it uh, a lot more broadly. Otherwise, well,
sure.
what would be the point of it? But how it applies to particular technologies will be tricky. I mean, so one example actually is during World War II. There's a case of radio broadcasting, like people like Axis Sally or Tokyo Rose who broadcast, I mean, enemy propaganda over the radio waves. And then it wasn't deemed enough just to have people who heard the broadcast testify. They actually had to have people who were in the room watching them make the broadcast. And so the Justice Department, after World War II, brought in people from Japan, from Germany, who were able to say this person was actually making this broadcast. And so that was sort of continuing to rely on a very 18th century sense of a witness who had directly saw what had happened, even though one might think it makes a little more sense to say anyone who heard the broadcast could equally be a witness.
Yeah. I suppose the obvious way to kind of clarify then debates regarding, how do we apply the Constitution for sort of modern technologies emerging is just a constitutional amendment then. Like if there's something that clearly needs to be edited with the Constitution, then we can change it through an amendment process. Of course, that's quite difficult, but
Yeah, it's quite difficult, and in many cases, it may not be necessary in the sense that you might always be able to prosecute the person for some other crime.
yeah,
So just because there's a technical impediment to a treason prosecution, often they've done something else quite bad as well. And so they, in an enemy case, maybe it's a type of espionage or providing material support to a terrorist organization, or internally, if it's levying war, you probably charge them with, murder or arson or attacking a building or something like that.
right. Yeah, I mean, I guess, you know, it seems like this conversation then has started to come up more and more in the world today, especially I guess after January 6th, there's been a lot of debate after like, what we consider this crime to be. How do you think the founding fathers would have reacted to that, and what would they have kind of determined to be the crime committed in that case?
Yeah, it's actually had a short piece in the Washington Post on January 7th, 2021, arguing that the founding fathers would have viewed the attack on the Capitol as a type of treason by levying war. That this was sort of the very heart of that type of treason, an armed assault on the center of government with the intent of disrupting a governmental procedure. I don't think there would have been any doubt in their mind that that could have been tried as treason. Now, it gets a little complicated because there's some later decisions from the mid 19th century which suggests that your intent has to be not just to obstruct the government in some way, but to overthrow the government entirely.
Hmm.
And then that raises a very hard question as to whether January 6th was an attempt to overthrow the government entirely or just to obstruct part of it. And that's particularly problematic if you think that the people there were arguably there on the orders of the president. And so you potentially had a dispute between Congress and the president, which one really is the government
Yeah.
in those circumstances. And so it's not surprising that the Justice Department hasn't indicted anyone for treason in those cases.
Yeah, that does seem to be a very unique situation. I mean, uh, I it is also kind of scary because I guess this kind of question could pop up again potentially. I suppose if there's another contested election where we have this, a similar dilemma. I mean, how do you think, people are going to kind of figure this situation out?
Yeah, well, I hope there won't be any more January 6th. I mean, I hope that on the first part, we've learned to secure the Capitol much
Yeah,
better. And so that one won't happen. And then that the people who are inclined to do that hopefully will have been deterred by some of these prosecutions, and you won't have a president of the United States egging them on the way we did in 2020. Um, I honestly think the greater threat potentially to elections is not an armed mob, but more insidious types of cheating, refusing to certify elections,
yeah.
you know, coming up with specious objections to the electoral count, things like that are probably more likely threats to um, peaceful transition of power than sort of just armed mobs.
Right. Yeah, I mean, obviously, yeah, a mob is not an extremely well thought out plan to kind of overthrow a government or something. It's mostly just a bunch of random people acting on impulse, I suppose.
Yeah, because it wasn't really clear what the January 6 people thought they were going to do once they were in there. What was the end game
Right.
that resulted in the presidency not being certified? And that just didn't seem to be thought out in any
No.
coherent manner.
No. No, it did seem pretty if you were to think about like yeah, trying to do something that they were clearly trying to obstruct the nation's kind of election results, you would think that's not exactly a good plan to do it. Um, and I agree. I think it is, institutionally, if you can, corrupt the system so much that you can just, basically make up your own rules as you go. That's the much more efficient way of trying to obstruct the election results versus just random people rushing into the Capitol. But
Right.
so, um, so then think about January 6th. What role, because I know a lot of people had kind of talked about this, what role did Donald Trump kind of play then in terms of like the a concept of treason? Would the founding fathers look at Donald Trump as having committed treason as a sitting president or
Yeah, that's actually it's a very hard question. Because to sort of put it in, I suppose, in the most pro Donald Trump way uh, view, you would argue that all he did was make a speech. He made a speech to his supporters. He supposedly told them to go protest peacefully. The fact that they didn't do that isn't his fault. And freedom of speech, we protect even incitements um, uh, to violence if they're not sort of imminent and likely. And he could try to argue that this was protected speech when he talks about fighting. That's just the way politicians talk all the time. And we saw that word over and over again at the Democratic convention in 2024. And so he would say that you can't treat political rhetoric as a form of treason. Now, the counter to that argument would be that, well, those people are only there because he had sort of assembled them. He had brought them there. He egged them on in circumstances where he knew they were likely to be armed by not having magnetometers at his event on the ellipse, that he essentially encouraged them to march on the Capitol. And then maybe most critically, when they were there, he didn't do anything to stop them, and actually sent out tweets that inflamed the situation even more. And so I think you could make an argument that if individual members of the mob were susceptible to a treason charge, then he should be too, that you shouldn't sort of punish the foot soldiers while leaving the clear general
Yeah.
of the event untouched. But again, it's not clear that even the foot soldiers necessarily committed an act of treason. And so, unless you're willing to say that everybody involved was part of this, I think it'd be quite hard to make that case against Trump.
Yeah. I mean, do you think then, when you think about the American constitutional law, do you think that kind of the era we're living in has exposed some kind of gaps in our law and how we interpret it and collectively agree upon what the law is?
Well, I think it's revealed that the Constitution assumes a certain basic level of good faith and competence in government officials, and when that's not there, um, then the system just doesn't work the way that it's supposed to. And I think the framers were well aware of people like Donald Trump. They knew people like that. People like that existed in 18th century America. They've existed throughout history. Sort of demagogues without any real qualification for office, but very good at riling people up. I think they hoped that their constitutional system would keep those people out of office, that such a person would never prevail in the electoral college. And that assumption, I think, is proven to be not true. And so lots of things you don't write into a constitution saying, here's a list of 1,000 terrible things the president should never do,
Yeah.
right? Because you could make that list go on for years, but you just got to assume that that's not going to happen. So you don't bother to write it in. And then someone goes and does things that kind of expose all of those seams. Um, yeah, it's very hard, I think, for any constitution to deal with those kinds of problems because they all assume a certain base level of good faith.
Yeah. I mean, does it feel to you that we're kind of in, one of those particular points in American history where there's going to have to be some type of change to move forward as a nation? Because obviously you have you have the American Revolution, the beginning of this country, you have the Civil War, a major era defining how the country would go forward. And now we have, really this has been like the first super contested election where violence broke out in this way, and someone's not accepting their election results and now running again for office. Does this feel like kind of another historical breaking point for the nation to you?
I hopefully we're not there yet.
Okay.
I mean, could it be down the road? Sure, but I don't think that's really the case. I mean, because if you set aside January 6th itself, there was
Mm-hmm.
very little other political violence associated with the election. There's people haven't been marching on the streets with Biden in office. We've had 3.5 years of him, and basically things have been um, devoid of turmoil. We had Donald Trump indicted. We didn't see people rising up in arms. We had Donald Trump convicted. We didn't see people rising up in arms. We saw Donald Trump, potentially shot
Yeah.
by someone, and that um, a horrific event. But it seems to be a lone individual, not part of larger political violence. So I'm hopeful that this is something that will pass. I mean, it doesn't really seem like sort of the pre-Civil War, where you had a country so fundamentally divided on a basic issue like slavery, and where the division was really geographic in a very stark way. And that's just not the case here. You have Democrats and Republicans scattered throughout the country. And so
Yeah.
you hear lots of talk about Civil War, but I'm cautiously optimistic that will not prove to be the case.
Yeah, I think that's a good point about just the geographical boundaries that existed during the Civil War, are obviously much different today. You don't have that clean cut southern northern state divide. Instead, you kind of have like this, urban rural divide to a certain extent, and that's a situation in every state.
Right. And so you would have, say the cities of Houston and Dallas and Texas would be basically blue cities,
Yeah,
and large chunks of Pennsylvania would be red. And so it's much more a divide that really permeates the entire nation. And so if it were to happen, in some ways, it'd probably be worse because it would really be parts of states fighting other parts
yeah,
uh, of uh, of the same state.
yeah. That's true. That would be like a bunch of miniature, like sort of civil wars in each state, I guess.
Right.
Yeah, as part of one collective one. Yeah. Um, so do you know what do you think then about sort of uh how does the nation handle then another potential contested election? How could that potentially play out, and what could we do as a society to kind of navigate that? Because a lot of people are concerned that um, that is a very likely scenario potentially if it happens, if the election outcome is a certain way.
So it's a hard question. I think the best you can do is prepare as much as you possibly can. Be ready for possible legal challenges. Be ready with teams of lawyers. Be ready to make the case. Hopefully, prepare people to understand what's happening. So if, for example, as I believe in Pennsylvania, they can't count early votes until election day, you're going to see the composition of the ballots look very different. And if people understand that, they're not going to, believe claims that, oh, suddenly the election was stolen because we happened to count some other ballots. And I think that's the best uh, one can do, and hopefully have faith in the courts. The courts, did a good job in 2020. They rejected almost all of these challenges as completely frivolous, and some of the most strident denunciations of some of the Trump campaign's assertions came from Trump appointed judges. And so I'm hopeful, that those same judges will, try to do as fair and as just a job as possible. Now, are there a handful who might be real problems? Sure, but um, they won't have the last word on it.
Yeah. I mean, if Trump were to get elected again and, wanted to kind of push the law aside a little bit, do you think that there'd be enough judges to kind of stand up against that? To kind of like, oh no, the checks and balances are still important here.
I'm hopeful that there are. Yes, um, his justices, the three he appointed to the Supreme Court, have sort of um, widely different views on a lot of things. They're certainly not just carbon copies of each other,
Right.
and they have tended, in some circumstances, to rule in ways that Trump has not liked. I think he's been unhappy with them in a handful of cases, and I also think they are aware of the serious implications for the country of egregiously bad rulings. Now, that said, if it's a very, very close election, the temptation to do something a little shady would probably be very, very high, as we saw, I think, in Bush versus Gore
Right.
in 2000. But if the claim is, there's 20,000 ballots sitting in a barrel somewhere, and there's no evidence of that whatsoever, no court's going to accept
Right.
those claims.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's incredibly interesting times. It's always interesting to think about. We're living in, historical times that will be written about by future historians
Right.
who didn't live through it. And we're talking about, like how people were analyzing it and thinking about it and what they were doing about it. Do you think the founding fathers have been surprised that we found ourselves in this situation?
I don't know. I mean, I think they had a fairly realistic sense of human beings in all of their possibilities and in all of their weaknesses.
Yeah.
And they certainly understood that people are complex, and that very few people are going to be completely acting out of disinterested virtue. And so I think they would understand that sort of just all of the wrangling and arguing and disagreement that happens as part of politics is just part of the way humans are constituted, and it's going to be like that probably forever.
Yeah. Yeah, that's probably true. Yeah. Well, what are you currently working on then?
I'm currently working on a book on the Declaration of Independence, hopefully for the year 2026 and the
Oh,
250th
cool.
anniversary.
Wow. Okay. So that's yeah, that'll be a big one then.
Yeah.
250th. So that's awesome. Great. And what's the best way for people to kind of keep track of your work and follow you?
Well, I have a website, carltonlarson.com. I'm also on Twitter. I guess they now call X, I still call it Twitter,
Yeah.
uh, at Carlton FW Larson.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much again for coming on and sharing all your knowledge about this incredibly relevant topic. And also nice to have some hopeful takes about the country's future in times of uncertainty. So,
Well, thanks. Pleasure to be here.